My stepmother told everyone I was broken goods after my divorce. I made sure she felt what broken really meant. The first time Diana called me broken goods was at my father's retirement party, 3 months after my divorce was finalized. She said it quietly to her book club friends while I was refilling the punch bowl, but the kitchen had that weird acoustic thing where sound carried perfectly from the dining room. I heard every word. She told them I'd driven my wife away with my career obsession, and now I was damaged merchandise that no decent woman would want. Her friends made sympathetic noises while I stood there holding a ladle, watching red punch drip back into the bowl. My father was in the backyard showing off his new grill to former colleagues, completely oblivious to his wife poisoning my reputation 20 feet away. I walked back into the dining room with the refilled bowl and made eye contact with Diana. She smiled at me with those perfectly whitened teeth and asked if I was feeling all right because I looked pale. I told her I was fine and excused myself to the bathroom where I sat on the closed toilet lid and tried to stop shaking. The marriage had ended because my ex-wife had been sleeping with her yoga instructor for 18 months, but I'd kept that detail private to protect her reputation. Nobody in my family knew the real reason except my younger brother Lucas, who'd helped me move out of the house while she was at a wellness retreat. Diana had somehow decided the divorce was my fault and appointed herself the family spokesperson on my failed marriage. I worked as a senior civil engineer at a construction management firm, leading teams that designed infrastructure projects for municipal clients across the region. The job required 60-hour weeks during major builds and constant travel to project sites. My ex-wife, Melissa, had been a pharmaceutical sales representative who worked similar hours, and we'd built our lives around two ambitious careers. When I discovered the affair through a text message she'd forgotten to delete, I'd confronted her immediately. She admitted everything and said the instructor made her feel alive in ways I never had because I was always focused on work. I filed for divorce the next week and moved into a rental condo near my office. The whole process took 8 months and cost me $40,000 in legal fees, but I walked away with my retirement accounts intact and no alimony obligations in either direction. My father had been sympathetic in his quiet way, offering to help me move and asking if I needed anything. Diana had made comments about marriage requiring compromise and how modern men didn't understand emotional availability. I'd ignored her because engaging with Diana's opinions was like arguing with a television. She'd married my father 5 years ago, 2 years after my mother died from ovarian cancer, and immediately started redecorating everything and inserting herself into family dynamics that had worked fine without her input. The broken goods comment spread through the family faster than I expected. My aunt called the next week to ask if I was seeing a therapist to work through my intimacy issues. My cousin sent a long email about the importance of emotional connection and suggested I read some relationship books, even though I wasn't in a relationship anymore. My father's brother cornered me at a hardware store to say he'd heard I'd prioritized work over my marriage, and maybe I should consider a less demanding job. Each conversation made it clear that Diana's version of events had become the accepted family narrative. I was the workaholic husband who'd neglected his wife until she had no choice but to leave. The truth about Melissa's affair stayed buried because I'd made the mistake of taking the high road and not defending myself publicly. My brother Lucas was furious when I told him what was happening and wanted to send a group text exposing Melissa's cheating, but I stopped him. I said it wouldn't change anything and would just make me look bitter and vindictive. Diana had won the narrative war before I even realized we were fighting. 6 months later, my father invited me to Sunday dinner at their house, and I almost said no. Lucas convinced me to go because avoiding family events would just confirm Diana's story that I was bitter and damaged. I drove to their house in the suburbs and found Diana's entire extended family already there, which my father hadn't mentioned. Her sister and brother-in-law, her 2 adult daughters from her first marriage, her elderly mother, and several cousins I'd never met were crowded into the living room drinking wine and eating cheese. My father hugged me at the door and apologized for not warning me that it was a combined family dinner. Diana swept over in a flowing blue dress and announced to everyone that I was her stepson who'd just gone through a difficult divorce. She said it with the kind of sympathetic head tilt that made my skin crawl, and several people looked at me with pity. Her older daughter, Ashley, asked what I did for work, and when I explained my job, Diana jumped in to say that was probably why my marriage didn't work out. She told everyone that career-driven men often struggled to maintain healthy relationships because they couldn't balance work and family. Her mother nodded and said young men today didn't understand that marriage required putting your wife first. I excused myself to the bathroom and seriously considered leaving, but my father was so happy to have everyone together that I couldn't bail. Dinner was worse. Diana seated me between her mother and her younger daughter, Brittany, who spent the entire meal talking about her graduate program and her boyfriend. Diana's mother asked me intrusive questions about my marriage and whether I'd considered that Melissa might have left because I wasn't attentive enough. She said her generation understood that women needed their husbands to make them feel cherished, and modern men had forgotten that basic truth. I smiled and said my marriage ended for private reasons I wasn't discussing, which made Diana's mother purse her lips and mutter about young people having no manners. After dinner, while I was helping clear plates, Diana told her sister loud enough for everyone to hear that she worried about me because divorced men over 30 had such a hard time finding quality women. She said the dating pool was full of women who just wanted something casual, and I'd probably end up alone unless I adjusted my expectations. Her sister asked if I was dating yet, and Diana answered for me that I was probably too focused on work to even try. My father was in the garage showing Ashley his woodworking setup and missed the entire conversation. I finished loading the dishwasher and told Diana I needed to leave early for work the next morning. She walked me to the door and said she hoped I wasn't upset about anything because she was only trying to help by being honest. I drove home and sat in my driveway for 20 minutes, trying to decide if confronting her would make things better or worse. 3 months passed, and Diana's campaign intensified. She started a family group chat and regularly posted articles about work-life balance, the importance of marriage, and how career men were experiencing an epidemic of loneliness. She never mentioned me directly, but the timing was obvious, especially when she'd post something right after I'd shared a work achievement. When I got promoted to senior project director and posted about it on social media, Diana sent a private message saying she was happy for me, but hoped I'd learned from my past mistakes about putting work first. She said my new role would require even more hours, and I should think carefully about what I wanted my life to look like in 10 years. I didn't respond because anything I said would just fuel her narrative. My father called to congratulate me on the promotion and mentioned that Diana thought I should be careful about work consuming my life. I asked him directly if he believed I'd caused my divorce through career obsession, and he got quiet. He said he didn't know what happened in my marriage and wasn't taking sides, but Diana had made some good points about balance. The fact that my own father was buying into her story made me angrier than anything else she'd done. My younger brother Lucas got engaged that spring to his longtime girlfriend, Samantha, and the wedding planning became Diana's new project. Diana immediately positioned herself as the primary planner, even though Lucas barely knew her and had our aunt lined up to help. Diana showed up to every vendor meeting and every planning session with opinions and suggestions. She took over the family group chat with constant updates and polls about wedding details. When Lucas tried to politely establish boundaries, Diana told my father that his son was being difficult and ungrateful for her help. My father asked Lucas to just let Diana be involved because it made her feel included in the family. Lucas called me frustrated and said he felt like his wedding was being hijacked, but he didn't want to cause drama with Dad's wife. I told him I'd run interference and started attending all the planning meetings to create a buffer between Diana and my brother. Diana was annoyed by my presence, but couldn't say anything without looking petty. She compensated by making pointed comments about my failed marriage whenever wedding topics came up. When the photographer asked about family photos, Diana suggested keeping divorced family members out of the main shots because it was bad luck. When the caterer mentioned menu options, Diana said we should avoid anything too sophisticated or complicated because that approach reflected the kind of cold perfectionism that destroyed relationships. The breaking point came at Lucas's bachelor party planning meeting, which Diana somehow inserted herself into by claiming she needed to coordinate with the venue. She'd shown up at the restaurant where Lucas's groomsmen were discussing plans and started giving advice about appropriate activities for engaged men. She talked about the importance of respecting your future spouse and how bachelor parties that got too wild showed a lack of commitment. She said too many modern men went into marriage without understanding that their single days were over, and those marriages always failed. Then she looked directly at me and said she hoped Lucas would learn from the cautionary tales in our family about what happens when men don't prioritize their marriages. Lucas's best friend looked confused, and several groomsmen seemed uncomfortable. I stood up and thanked Diana for the advice, then suggested she let Lucas's friends handle the bachelor party planning. Diana smiled and said she was just trying to help Lucas avoid common mistakes, and surely I could appreciate that given my experience. That's when I decided Diana needed to understand exactly what broken really meant. I started doing research that night. Diana had been married twice before my father, which I'd known, but I'd never dug into the details. Her first marriage had ended in her early 20s after 3 years, which she'd always described as a youthful mistake. Her second marriage lasted 15 years and produced her 2 daughters, Ashley and Brittany. She'd always said that marriage ended because her husband became controlling and difficult, and she'd finally left for her own well-being. I started searching public records and social media and found her second ex-husband, Thomas, living in a different state. His Facebook profile was sparse, but he had some old photos and posts. I created a fake account and sent him a message saying I was researching family history and wondered if he'd be willing to answer some questions about his marriage to Diana. He responded within an hour and said he'd be happy to talk because he wished someone had warned him before he married her. We set up a phone call for the next evening. Thomas told me everything during that hour-long conversation. Diana had been the controlling one in their marriage, managing every aspect of their lives and making all decisions about money, the kids, and their social life. She'd isolated him from his friends and family by constantly creating drama and making him choose between her and them. She'd opened credit cards in his name without telling him and run up massive debt shopping and redecorating their house every few months. When he'd finally confronted her about the financial situation, she'd accused him of financial abuse and told everyone he wouldn't let her spend money. She'd filed for divorce and taken him to court, claiming he'd been emotionally abusive and controlling. Thomas said he'd been so exhausted from years of her manipulation that he'd settled for an unfavorable agreement just to escape. He'd lost the house, paid substantial child support, and spent years rebuilding his credit and reputation. He said Ashley and Brittany barely spoke to him because Diana had spent their entire childhood telling them their father was a bad man. Thomas sent me copies of court documents, financial records, and text messages that showed Diana's spending patterns and manipulative behavior. He said if I was dealing with her now, I should know she was an expert at playing the victim while destroying people behind the scenes. I spent the next week collecting more information. I found Diana's first ex-husband through LinkedIn and sent a carefully worded message. He responded and told me their marriage ended because Diana had cheated on him multiple times and then blamed him for being emotionally unavailable. He said she'd spread rumors about him being abusive to explain the divorce, and he'd lost friends over her lies. I searched Diana's social media history and found contradictions everywhere. She'd posted about expensive purchases during the same periods. She was claiming poverty in divorce documents. She'd claimed to be a devoted mother, while Thomas's records showed she'd frequently left the girls with babysitters to take trips with friends. I compiled everything into organized files with dates, documents, and screenshots. The picture that emerged was of someone who spent decades manipulating narratives, playing victim, and destroying anyone who challenged her. She'd done it to 2 husbands, and was now doing it to me. But I had something her previous victims didn't have: access to her current life and a witness to her behavior. Lucas's wedding was 3 months away, and I needed to time everything perfectly. Diana was in full control mode, managing every detail and making the wedding about herself. She'd convinced my father to pay for significant portions of the wedding by claiming Lucas needed help, even though Lucas and Samantha had budgeted carefully and didn't need the money. Diana used the financial contribution to justify her control over decisions. She'd also started telling people she was basically planning the entire wedding because Lucas was too overwhelmed with work. The truth was, Lucas had everything under control until Diana inserted herself. I watched Diana operate for those months and saw her patterns clearly. She'd offer help that wasn't needed, then use that help to claim credit and control. She'd create problems and then solve them to look like a hero. She'd spread subtle criticisms about people while positioning herself as caring and concerned. Every move was calculated to make her look good while diminishing someone else. I hired a private investigator to document Diana's current activities, which felt extreme but necessary. The investigator followed her for 3 weeks and discovered she was having an affair with her Pilates instructor, a man 15 years younger than her. She was meeting him at his apartment twice a week, while my father was at his volunteer position at the Veterans Center. The investigator got photos of her entering and leaving the apartment, always carefully dressed and made up. He also documented her spending habits and found she'd opened 2 credit cards in my father's name without his knowledge. She was using them to fund her shopping addiction and her affair, including buying expensive gifts for the instructor. The credit card statements showed purchases at lingerie stores, jewelry stores, and high-end restaurants my father never went to. I added this evidence to my growing file and felt something dark settle in my stomach. Diana had been calling me broken while actively destroying her own marriage and stealing from my father. The next family dinner happened a month before the wedding, and Diana was holding court about final wedding preparations. She'd made decoration decisions without consulting Lucas and changed the bar service to include drinks Samantha didn't like. When Lucas tried to object, Diana said she'd paid for part of the wedding and deserved input. My father backed Diana up and asked Lucas to be flexible. I watched this dynamic and realized Diana had been using my father's money and authority to control Lucas the same way she'd controlled her previous husbands. After dinner, I asked my father if we could talk privately. We went to his home office, and I asked him directly about his finances. He looked confused and said everything was fine. I asked if he'd opened any new credit cards recently, and he said no. I showed him copies of the credit card statements the investigator had found. His face went white as he scrolled through charges he didn't recognize. He asked where I'd gotten this information, and I said I'd hired someone to look into Diana's activities because her behavior concerned me. He got angry and said I had no right to investigate his wife. I told him his wife was stealing from him and probably doing worse. My father didn't believe me about the affair initially. He said Diana loved him and would never cheat, and I was probably still bitter about my own divorce. I showed him the surveillance photos of Diana entering and leaving the instructor's apartment. He stared at them for a long time without saying anything. Then he asked why I was doing this, and if I was trying to destroy his marriage out of spite. I told him I was protecting him from someone who'd done this to multiple people before him. I showed him everything I'd collected, the information from both ex-husbands, the court documents, the financial records, the pattern of manipulation and lies. He read through everything while I sat there watching his face change from defensive to confused to devastated. When he finished, he asked me to leave because he needed time to think. I left the documents with him and drove home feeling sick. I'd just blown up my father's marriage, and I wasn't sure if he'd forgive me or choose Diana over the evidence. 3 days later, my father called and asked if I could come over while Diana was at her book club. I drove to his house and found him looking like he'd aged 10 years. He said he'd confronted Diana about the credit cards, and she'd initially denied everything, then claimed she'd opened them for household expenses he'd authorized. When he pressed her about specific charges, she'd said he was being financially controlling and abusive. He'd expected that response after reading about her patterns. Then he'd asked about the Pilates instructor, and Diana had broken down crying and admitted to the affair. She'd said she'd been lonely because my father didn't pay enough attention to her, and the instructor made her feel young and attractive. She'd blamed my father for pushing her into another man's arms by being emotionally unavailable. My father said listening to her manipulate him in real time while knowing her history was like watching a magic trick after someone explained how it worked. He'd told her he wanted a divorce, and she'd immediately switched tactics to begging and promising to change. When that didn't work, she'd threatened to tell everyone he was abusive and take everything in the divorce. He'd recorded that conversation on his phone after I'd warned him she'd make accusations. Diana moved out of the house that week, staying with her sister while my father consulted with a divorce attorney. She immediately started her campaign of victim narratives, telling anyone who would listen that my father had become paranoid and controlling in his retirement. She claimed he'd accused her of cheating without evidence and kicked her out. She said the family had turned against her because they'd never accepted her. My father's friends were confused by the sudden split, and some of them called him to ask what was going on. He didn't share details initially, trying to handle things privately. Diana took his silence as an opportunity to control the narrative. She posted vague messages on social media about betrayal and discovering people's true colors. Her book club friends rallied around her with supportive comments. She told Lucas that the divorce was my fault, because I'd turned my father against her with lies. Lucas called me confused and said Diana was creating drama right before the wedding. I told him everything I'd found and explained that Diana had been manipulating all of us for years. Lucas was shocked and angry and said he'd never trusted Diana but thought she was just annoying, not dangerous. The wedding was 4 weeks away when Diana made her biggest mistake. She sent a long email to the entire family explaining that she and my father were divorcing because our family had never accepted her. She specifically blamed me, saying I'd been jealous of her relationship with my father and had fabricated lies to destroy their marriage. She wrote that I was a bitter, broken man who couldn't stand to see other people happy in their relationships. She said I'd hired a private investigator to stalk her and had manipulated evidence to make her look bad. The email accused me of being vindictive and damaged beyond repair, and she warned other family members that I was dangerous. She ended by saying she hoped I'd get the psychological help I clearly needed. The email went to 43 people, including my father's entire extended family, Diana's family, and several family friends. My phone started ringing immediately with people asking what was going on. My father forwarded me Diana's email and said we needed to respond with facts. I created a detailed response email and sent it to my father for approval before sending it to the family. The email started with an apology for the public nature of what I was about to share, but said Diana's accusations required a factual response. I explained that I'd become concerned about Diana's behavior toward me and other family members and had investigated her background. I provided a summary of what I'd found about her previous marriages, including quotes from both ex-husbands and copies of relevant court documents. I explained the credit card fraud my father had discovered and included account statements with Diana's purchases highlighted. I shared the evidence of the affair, including dates and locations, but not explicit photos. I explained that Diana had a documented pattern of manipulating situations, playing victim, and making false accusations when caught. I noted that she'd done this to multiple people over decades and was now doing it again. I ended by saying I took no pleasure in exposing this information, but Diana's email had forced me to defend myself with facts. I asked family members to review the evidence before believing anyone's narrative. My father read it and said to send it. The fallout was immediate and explosive. Diana called my father screaming that I'd destroyed her reputation and she was going to sue me for defamation. My father told her that truth wasn't defamation and hung up on her. Diana's sister called me and said I was a vindictive bastard who'd ruined her sister's life. I told her to read the documents and explain which parts were fabricated. She hung up on me. Several family members called my father to say they'd always felt something was off about Diana and were glad he'd discovered the truth. My aunt said she'd never liked how Diana talked about me and now understood it was projection. Thomas, Diana's second ex-husband, sent me an email thanking me for finally exposing her and saying he wished someone had done it years ago. Diana's daughters, Ashley and Brittany, sent angry messages defending their mother and calling me a liar. I responded by sending them the same documents I'd sent everyone else, and suggested they ask their father for his side of the story. Diana posted on social media that she was the victim of a smear campaign by a mentally unstable stepson who couldn't handle his own failed life. Several people commented asking if she was talking about me, and others commented defending me and posting links to the evidence I'd shared. 2 weeks before Lucas's wedding, my father's divorce attorney sent Diana a formal letter outlining the evidence of credit card fraud and affair and offering her a choice. She could agree to a quick, quiet divorce with a fair split of only premarital assets, or he'd file a contested divorce including criminal fraud charges for the credit cards and take the affair evidence public in court. The letter gave her 48 hours to decide. Diana hired her own attorney, who apparently reviewed the evidence and advised her to take the settlement. She signed the divorce agreement 3 days later. My father got the house, his retirement accounts, and separation of all debts. Diana got her personal belongings and nothing else. The attorney also made Diana sign a non-disparagement agreement stating she wouldn't make false accusations about my father or anyone in his family. If she violated it, she'd face legal consequences and financial penalties. My father told me about the agreement and said Diana had signed everything without fighting because her attorney told her she'd lose badly if it went to court. Lucas's wedding happened on a perfect Saturday in June, and Diana wasn't there. Lucas had uninvited her immediately after the truth came out, and my father had supported that decision. The day was everything my brother wanted, with his actual friends and family celebrating without Diana's controlling presence. My father walked Samantha down the aisle at her request, since her own father had passed away years earlier, and gave a toast at the reception about family meaning the people who truly love and support you. Several relatives made comments about how much better the energy was without Diana creating drama. I stood next to Lucas during the ceremony as his best man, and he told me afterward that he was grateful I'd exposed Diana before she could poison his marriage the way she'd tried to poison mine. We celebrated while Lucas and Samantha danced with their friends, and I felt something heavy lift off my chest. The weeks after the wedding brought unexpected developments. Ashley, Diana's older daughter, reached out to me through email and asked if we could talk. She'd contacted her father Thomas for the first time in 5 years and heard his side of the divorce. Thomas had shared documents and stories that contradicted everything Diana had told her daughters growing up. Ashley said she was realizing her mother had lied to her about her father and probably about many other things. She apologized for the angry messages and said she was trying to process years of manipulation. I told her I understood and suggested she consider therapy to work through it, which is what I'd been doing. Her sister Brittany apparently wasn't ready to face the truth yet and was still defending Diana on social media, but Ashley said that might change with time. I was surprised to feel sympathy for Diana's daughters, who'd grown up with her manipulation and were now dealing with the collapse of their understanding of their childhood. Diana's book club friends gradually distanced themselves after the evidence became public. Several of them had suspected she'd been having an affair, but hadn't said anything. Others admitted they'd felt uncomfortable with how she talked about people behind their backs, but had thought it was just gossip. One woman sent me an apologetic message saying Diana had told them terrible things about me, and she felt guilty for believing the stories without questioning them. She said Diana had a way of making herself seem credible and sympathetic while destroying other people's reputations. I responded that Diana had years of practice at that skill, and nobody should feel bad for being manipulated by an expert. The woman said their book club had essentially dissolved because nobody trusted each other anymore after discovering how much Diana had been lying to all of them. Diana's social circle had collapsed along with her marriage, and she'd moved to a different state to live near her younger daughter and start over somewhere nobody knew her history. My father spent months processing everything and eventually started dating someone he met through his volunteer work. She was a widow his age who'd lost her husband to a heart attack and understood grief and starting over. He took things slowly and introduced her to the family carefully, clearly terrified of making another mistake. Lucas and I liked her immediately because she was genuine and kind and didn't try to insert herself into family dynamics or control situations. She treated my father like a partner instead of a project, and he seemed lighter around her. He told me one night over dinner that he'd learned the difference between someone who loved him and someone who used him, and he was grateful I'd cared enough to show him the truth, even when it was painful. I told him I'd spent my whole life watching him sacrifice for family, and he deserved better than what Diana had been doing to him. 6 months after the divorce, I ran into Melissa at a coffee shop near my office. She was there with her yoga instructor boyfriend, who was now her fiancé based on the ring she was wearing. They saw me at the same time I saw them, and Melissa's face went red. Her fiancé looked nervous and suggested they leave, but Melissa walked over to my table. She said she'd heard about what happened with Diana and my father, and wanted to apologize for her part in creating the situation. She explained that Diana had reached out to her after our divorce and asked her questions about why our marriage ended. She'd been honest about the affair and her feelings that I'd been too focused on work. Diana had apparently taken her words and weaponized them into her broken goods narrative. She said she'd never intended to help Diana hurt me, and felt terrible about it. I told her I'd figured out Diana had talked to her when her story got too specific about our marriage problems. I said I appreciated the apology, but she should know her affair had nothing to do with my career and everything to do with her choices. She nodded and said she knew that now, and therapy had helped her understand her own behavior. Her fiancé was watching from across the coffee shop looking uncomfortable, and I wondered if he knew he was engaged to someone who'd already proven she'd cheat when things got difficult. My promotion to senior project director came with new responsibilities and a team of 15 engineers reporting to me. The work was intense but satisfying, and I was good at it. Diana's narrative about my career destroying my life had been so persistent that I'd started to question my own choices. But watching my team succeed and building something meaningful made me realize my career wasn't the problem in my marriage or my life. The problem had been people who wanted to control me by making me doubt myself. Diana had tried to break me down by calling me broken, but all she'd done was show me how strong I actually was. I'd taken down someone with decades of experience manipulating people and systems, and I'd done it with evidence and strategy instead of emotion and gossip. The skills that made me good at my job, analytical thinking and systematic problem solving, had been exactly what I needed to expose Diana's patterns and protect my family. A year after Diana's divorce from my father, I got a LinkedIn message from her first ex-husband. He said he'd heard about what happened and wanted to thank me for documenting Diana's behavior in a way that might help other people recognize similar patterns. He'd been following the family drama through mutual connections and was amazed that someone had finally stood up to Diana with evidence. He said his own divorce had left him financially devastated and emotionally destroyed, and he'd always wished he'd thought to document her behavior before it was too late. He asked if I'd ever considered writing about what I'd learned about identifying and exposing manipulative people. I told him I'd thought about it, but wasn't sure I wanted to relive the experience. He said he understood, but thought my methodical approach to gathering evidence could help other people who were being manipulated and gaslit by someone like Diana. The message made me think about all the people who'd suffered because of Diana's lies, and all the people still suffering from similar situations with no idea how to prove what was happening to them. My brother Lucas and Samantha had their first child a year after their wedding and asked me to be the baby's godfather. We were having lunch at their house when Lucas told me he'd been thinking about Diana's impact on our family and how close we'd come to letting her control everything. He said watching me take Diana down with evidence and strategy had taught him something important about fighting back against people who use emotion and manipulation as weapons. He'd dealt with a difficult supervisor at work using similar tactics, documenting everything and presenting facts instead of engaging emotionally, and had gotten the supervisor investigated by HR. His supervisor was eventually transferred to a different department for creating a hostile work environment, and Lucas credited what he'd learned watching me deal with Diana. I told him I'd learned some of those strategies from my job and some from desperation when nothing else worked. He said the important thing was, it had worked, and Diana was gone, and our father was happy. We sat on his back porch drinking beer and watching Samantha hold their newborn son, and I felt grateful that my brother hadn't let Diana's poison touch his marriage the way it had infected so many other relationships. My father married his new partner, Jennifer, 2 years after his divorce from Diana. The wedding was small and intimate, just immediate family and close friends. He asked both Lucas and me to say a few words during the ceremony, and I talked about watching him choose truth and love over comfort and lies. Jennifer's adult children welcomed us into their extended family without drama or tension, and the contrast to Diana's constant chaos was striking. At the reception, my father pulled me aside and said he needed to tell me something. He'd been going through old financial records for tax purposes and discovered Diana had stolen more than he'd initially realized. She'd taken out a home equity loan without his knowledge 2 years into their marriage and used the money for personal expenses. She'd forged his signature on the documents, which meant she'd committed fraud. His attorney said he could pursue criminal charges, but it would take years and cost money. He decided to let it go because he just wanted Diana completely out of his life. I asked if he was sure because Diana had stolen tens of thousands of dollars from him. He said the money wasn't worth the emotional energy of staying connected to her through legal proceedings, and he'd rather focus on his new life with Jennifer. 3 years after Diana left, I started dating someone I met through work. Her name was Sophie, and she was an architect at a client company we worked with frequently. She asked me out after a particularly long meeting where we'd worked together to solve a complex design problem, and I'd said yes without overthinking it. Our first date turned into a 4-hour conversation about everything except work, and I realized I'd been so focused on rebuilding my career and reputation that I'd forgotten how good it felt to connect with someone. We dated for 8 months before she met my family, and I was nervous about introducing her to everyone after everything that had happened with Diana and Melissa. My father and Jennifer loved her immediately, and Lucas said she seemed genuine and kind. Sophie knew about my divorce and Diana's manipulation campaign because I'd told her everything early in our relationship, and she'd said it showed strength that I'd fought back instead of accepting Diana's narrative. 6 months later, I proposed during a weekend trip to the coast, and she said yes without hesitation. Planning my second wedding was completely different from my first. Melissa and I had gotten married young in a big traditional wedding that tried to please everyone's expectations. Sophie and I planned something smaller and more personal, focused on what we actually wanted instead of what we thought we should do. Diana was long gone from our lives, but her influence lingered in small ways. I caught myself overthinking decisions and worrying about what people would say, then realized I was still letting Diana's voice affect me, even though she was gone. My therapist helped me work through those patterns, and I slowly learned to make choices based on my own values instead of defending myself against imaginary criticism. My wedding day was perfect, in ways my first wedding hadn't been, because every choice reflected what Sophie and I actually wanted. My father walked Sophie down the aisle at her request, since her own father lived overseas, and Lucas stood next to me as my best man. During the reception, I looked around at all the people who'd supported me through the hardest years of my life, and I felt overwhelming gratitude that I'd fought for the truth instead of accepting Diana's lies. 4 years after Diana's departure, Ashley reached out to tell me her mother had gotten remarried to someone she'd met online. She'd met the new husband once and recognized all the same patterns Diana had used on her father and my father. The new husband was recently widowed and vulnerable, and Diana was already controlling his finances and isolating him from his adult children. Ashley had tried to warn the man, but Diana had convinced him that Ashley was a troubled daughter who made up stories about her mother. Ashley asked if I thought she should do what I'd done and investigate Diana's history to show the new husband the pattern. I told her it was her choice, but she should be prepared for the consequences of exposing her mother again. She said she felt responsible for protecting this person from what her mother would do, but she also knew it would mean permanently destroying her relationship with Diana. I told her I'd permanently destroyed my relationship with Diana, and it was one of the best decisions I'd ever made. She said she'd think about it and let me know what she decided. 2 months later, she sent me an email saying she'd contacted Diana's new husband and shared everything she knew about her mother's patterns. The man hadn't believed her initially, but agreed to look at his finances more carefully. He'd discovered Diana had already opened credit cards in his name and was spending money without telling him. The man had confronted Diana and ended the relationship before marrying her. Ashley said her mother had called her screaming that she'd ruined her life and she never wanted to speak to her again. She said she was sad but relieved. Sophie and I bought a house together 5 years after Diana left, and we spent months making it exactly what we wanted. No compromises based on what other people expected, no decorating to impress anyone, just creating a space that felt like home. My career continued to grow, and I eventually became vice president of engineering, leading 80 engineers across multiple regional offices. The work was demanding and fulfilling, and Sophie understood that my career was part of who I was, not something competing with our relationship. We balanced 2 ambitious careers by actually communicating and supporting each other, which seemed revolutionary after years of people telling me career success and relationship success were incompatible. My father and Jennifer came over for dinner regularly, and Lucas brought his 2 kids to play in our backyard. Family gatherings were easy and warm without Diana's constant manipulation and criticism. Sometimes I'd remember something Diana said and feel angry all over again, but mostly I felt grateful that I'd fought back when it would have been easier to just accept her narrative. 6 years after Diana left, I got a message from an account I didn't recognize, asking if I was the person who'd exposed Diana's manipulation. The message was from a woman named Rachel, who said Diana had married her uncle and was doing exactly what she'd done to her previous husbands. Rachel's uncle was in his 70s and had significant retirement savings, and Diana had gotten access to all of it within months of marrying him. Rachel had found my information through Ashley, who'd connected with her after Diana's previous relationship ended. She asked if I'd be willing to share what I'd learned about documenting Diana's behavior, because her uncle wouldn't believe the family's concerns without concrete proof. I spent 2 hours on the phone with Rachel explaining the investigation process, the types of evidence that mattered, and the importance of involving attorneys and potentially law enforcement. She said her uncle deserved better than what Diana was doing to him, and she was going to fight for him the way I'd fought for my father. 3 months later, Rachel sent me an update that her uncle had discovered Diana's credit card fraud and affair with another man. He'd divorced her and filed a police report about the fraud. Diana was facing criminal charges in his state and might actually see jail time for what she'd done. The criminal charges against Diana moved slowly through the court system, but Rachel kept me updated on the progress. Diana had hired an expensive attorney who tried to get the charges dismissed, but the evidence was overwhelming. She'd opened 8 credit cards in her elderly husband's name and charged over $100,000 before he discovered what was happening. The prosecutor was treating it as elder abuse because of the victim's age and vulnerability. Diana's attorney tried to argue she'd had permission to use the cards, but the husband's testimony and documentation proved otherwise. She was eventually convicted of multiple counts of fraud and identity theft and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Ashley sent me the news article about her conviction and said she felt conflicted about her mother going to prison, but relieved she couldn't hurt anyone else for a while. I told her feeling conflicted was normal and healthy, and she should focus on her own healing instead of managing her mother's consequences. Diana would serve her time and probably emerge with new manipulation tactics, but at least there was now a legal record of her patterns. My life settled into something stable and happy, which felt strange after years of chaos and fighting. Sophie and I celebrated our 5th anniversary with a trip to Japan, and I realized I'd spent more time in my second marriage than I had fighting with Diana. My career was thriving, my relationships were healthy, and my father was happy with Jennifer. Lucas's kids called me uncle and climbed all over Sophie during family dinners. The broken goods label Diana had tried to pin on me felt absurd now, looking at everything I'd built after she'd tried to destroy me. I wasn't broken. I'd been targeted by someone who needed other people to be broken so she could feel powerful. Understanding that difference had been crucial to rebuilding my life. Diana had called me damaged and worthless, while she was the one leaving destruction everywhere she went. Exposing her patterns hadn't just protected my father and cleared my reputation. It had shown me that fighting back against manipulation with truth and evidence was possible, even when the manipulator had years of experience and a perfect victim act. 10 years after Diana first called me broken goods, I stood in my backyard watching my father play with Lucas's youngest child and felt something complete settle in my chest. Diana was in prison, her previous victims were healing, and her patterns were documented for anyone who needed to see them. I'd built a career I loved, a marriage that worked, and a family that actually functioned without constant drama and manipulation. The journey from that retirement party where Diana first poisoned my reputation to this peaceful afternoon had been brutal and exhausting, but I'd survived it. More than survived, I'd won by refusing to accept her narrative and fighting back with facts instead of emotion. Diana had tried to break me by calling me broken, but all she'd done was teach me exactly how strong I needed to be, and that strength, hard-won and tested through years of fighting her manipulation, was something nobody could ever take away from me again.